Hello nerds, today I'm going to be taking a look at the ARM version of Windows from a nerd's perspective. I'm going to compare it to older non-Intel x86 versions of Windows, along with showing you how well games run on it, along with the more important thing, which is how usage is in the real world. So get ready for probably the longest, most coherent video I've made on this channel. If you've turned into the tech media lately and seen them actually act as the marketing arm of tech companies instead of running unrelated essays about current events lately, you likely know all about the all-new ARM MacBooks, which are going to be the next big thing, of course, because it's Apple. See, Intel has a problem, and that is Intel's CPUs have been stagnating for years because Intel's kind of had a monopoly on the whole CPU market. Then there's been non-stop problems coming out of Intel lately. They're stuck on a dated manufacturing process. Their CPUs just aren't that much faster compared to their older ones. There's the whole meltdown and Scepter saga. And they've been charging tons of money as AMD has been making the CPUs people want. Intel hasn't had this much competition since AMD made 64-bit processors in the early 2000s, and everybody has now seen AMD go from being the butt of every joke about poor people building a gaming PC to, wow, this is the coolest thing ever. I need a Threadripper. I need Epic or whatever that CPU is called. I need the best, and AMD makes the best. But it gets worse for Intel because now Apple is switching to using their own in-house ARM processors and Macs instead of, buying whatever Intel is making this month. And this is definitely scaring Intel. So of course the tech journalists who with fat paychecks who believe everything Apple does is the best thing ever are writing about how this is the next big thing and how Intel and Microsoft especially are done. Apple using ARM processors in their Mac line is going to change the world. Never mind the fact they squandered their chance of being the sole platform in the 90s or even arguably the 80s when Steve Jobs canned the cloning program or their Apple II clone lawsuits. And even then, even with the cloning program, that was heavily controlled by Apple to begin with. But ARM might still have some chance of being the desktop CPU of the future where everybody has ARM in their computers instead of Intel's x86. And Microsoft is hedging their bets because they've put an ARM port of Windows out there. What, you didn't know there was an ARM port of Windows? Neither does most of the public outside of tech journalists complain it's not there yet. But here it is, ARM Windows. It's no longer a gimped version of Windows like RT was, but it's a full-fledged version of Windows for ARM processors, complete with an x86 or 32-bit in layman's terms program emulator. It can run The Sims, it can run Minecraft, it can run your favorite Office programs, it can run Zoom, and most importantly, it can run some older games at varying frame rates. In fact, Microsoft even supports compiling desktop software for it, unlike with RT. But it's also probably the most interesting version of Windows in a while, along with supporting some of the most interesting hardware, and I'll tell you why. Looking at the past can also show mistakes that ARM Windows has to avoid if it wants to be a viable operating system and not just another failed Microsoft product. So I'm going to go and start this video off by taking a look at the history of Windows NT on non-x86 platforms. Now, fair warning, I'm going to be going in depth on the history of Windows NT on non-x86 platforms. So I'm going to begin to sound like a grown adult in a cheap apartment in a not so great part of town explaining the deep lore of a kid's cartoon and why it's the deepest show ever. So bear with me. When Windows NT was new, because keep in mind this was the 90s and there were two Windows operating systems. There was Windows, which ran on top of DOS, and then there was this new operating system called Windows NT that with XP would become the Windows we know and love. And when Windows NT was new, it was designed to run on multiple RISC-based computers because RISC was the future in the 90s. That's what they were pushing for. In fact, one of the first CPUs Windows NT was written for was the failed Intel i860. After all, in the 90s, there was a huge and diverse amount of processors and technology compared to today, where the only diversity in technology consists of what color your iPhone comes in, and Windows NT reflected the 90s tech industry. Windows NT was ported to multiple different types of computers, with 4 folders on the Windows NT CD consisting of i386, which was your regular plain Jane PC you could buy at Walmart, Alpha, MIPS, and PowerPC. The idea was so that you could just pop the CD into your non-x86 Windows NT computer and a floppy depending on the platform and install the OS. And in fact, you could actually just install boxed copies of Windows NT on these other platforms as well. The MIPS platform required special computers designed solely for running Windows NT, but the Alpha and PowerPC versions ran on IBM's PowerPC machines and Digital's Alpha machines. All of these were expensive computers that cost thousands and thousands of dollars, and in the case of PowerPC and Alpha, they were designed to run entirely different operating systems such as Unix or OpenVMS, and this is what most customers opted for. These were mostly priced well out of the ballpark of any consumer, and they were never sold in stores like Best Buy or Walmart, with the exceptions being fire sale multias or second-hand machines found in dumpsters, closets, swap meets, and later eBay. Out of these, the Alpha version was the only one to gain some acceptance, and it outlasted the other two versions for quite some time, and this was reflected by the fact that it had ports of Visual C6 and Microsoft Office for it. It was also the only non-x86 version to have a 32-bit x86 emulator for it, and this was written by Digital themselves, while the other two versions only emulated 16-bit code, which is like Windows 3.1 software and a few DOS programs. In fact, Microsoft wasn't even the sole developer of this 16-bit emulator. They licensed it out from the soft Windows developers who had done a great job of writing PC emulators for non-Windows platforms of the day, such as Solaris or Max or IRIX or AIX, that sort of stuff. They wrote PC emulators for non-Windows platforms, and they licensed it from them. For Alpha, there was even a prototype version in 2000 that never made it past RC2, and a Microsoft internal full 64-bit version of Windows NT for Alpha that never saw the light of day, sadly, because they were killing Alpha. By the end of the 90s, there was a brand new Intel 64-bit CPU being pushed as the next big thing, called Itanium. It was slow, it was expensive, it was hard to code for, but it was intended to be the sole CPU in the high-end market. It was the dot-com bubble era of blind optimism and random dot-com websites and tech startups, so everyone fell for it. The idea for pushing Itanium was that it would trickle down to the lower end of the market as well over time and also shut out AMD. This never happened, of course, because AMD released a CPU that was a 64-bit version of x86 and 100% backwards compatible with any x86 software and operating system. And the next thing you know, Intel was building compatible CPUs as well that could also run 64-bit code. When AMD released Socket 754 onto the mainstream market, it was game over for any chance of Itanium being a mainstream CPU in the consumer market. But the reason I'm mentioning this here is for 3 reasons, and that the first is that the CPU wiped out several of x86's competitors on the high-end market segments, mainly high-end MIPS CPUs, Alpha, and PA-RISC, and 2 of them had NT ports. The second thing Itanium is notable for is that it introduced EFI as the boot firmware, and this would later be succeeded by UEFI, or UEFI, and Itanium systems, I think, actually used UEFI towards the end as well. The third and most relevant reason for bringing it up in this video is that Itanium had a Windows port as well, and needless to say, it was terrible in the compatibility era. When Itanium was new, someone benchmarked this new shiny prototype Itanium system against x86 systems, and the results were hilariously terrible. It was like, okay, not only did so many benchmarks not work on it, but it was as fast as a Pentium 100. And this was it was supposed to be the fastest CPU around, and this was embarrassing. 32-bit compatibility was okay for business programs, but trash for games. And speed was poor regardless, as the initial versions of Windows used a slow, special CPU compatibility mode that was slow. And later versions used a Intel-designed emulator because let's just say that compatibility mode was so slow, an emulator could run games faster. Well, software faster because it couldn't run games. Towards the end, Microsoft even blocked programs from installing on Itanium, and there are even specific error files on the install CDs for these programs if Itanium processors are detected. Most Itanium systems ended up being used for HPUX or OpenVMS anyhow, and sometimes Linux. Around 2010, Microsoft dropped Itanium development and announced that Server 2008 R2 would be the final version of Windows on Itanium, citing the complete lack of demand and how few people were actually buying it. All of these Windows ports had one thing in common, and this includes the Itanium version. Older programs were slowly emulated, and with the exception of the Alpha and Itanium ports, lagged a generation behind. For example, I'm going to use PowerPC Windows as my example here because I've got a box that can run it and it was easier to get out than the Itanium. On PowerPC Windows, if you install Microsoft Office, the CPU usage will skyrocket because the system is emulating 16-bit code just to install Office, and you'll find yourself waiting for the computer to do something already because it takes forever to install. Installing the Service Pack also involves watching an unzip program for DOS run and hog the CPU, and you'll be waiting for this as well. Even programs like Microsoft Word 6 also end up being CPU hogs because the system's emulating an x86 system, driving up the single CPU to 100% CPU usage as you write your essay. And they also have laughable game support on PowerPC, and MIPS 32-bit programs didn't even run on them. Instead of getting a canned "this app can't run" error message though, you get an error about how it's a valid executable for another platform. It's a more informative error message at least, and one that I feel that Microsoft should have carried over to ARM Windows. Maybe telling people what it's compiled for, or giving people a more details button telling them, hey, this program is not for ARM Windows, it's for ARM64 Windows. Tell your company, tell your program vendor to make a version of this for ARM. But who am I to judge? Who am I to judge? I'm just a basement dweller making $9.50 an hour and not a Microsoft employee who believes that all users are idiots who need their handheld and Windows updates forced on them. So, who am I to judge? Let's fast forward to the early 2010s, in which everything seemed so much better. Social media was still fun. The NSA leaks hadn't come out yet. The Xbox 360 was still around and games are still good. But quite a few of the weirder and interesting 90s CPUs died off in the high-end market, and even the consumer market. The x86 family ruled everywhere from consumer-grade desktops and laptops to high-end multiprocessor servers. Apple moved off of PowerPC and on to Intel. In the high-end, Itanium was on life support, PA RISC and Alpha were dead as a doornail, Spark was beginning to die after the Oracle buyout of Sun, and customers moved out of the Sun ecosystem because they didn't trust Oracle. And PowerPC was regulated to IBM servers only, which would run either AIX, IBM I, which used to be called OS400, and it's what ran on the AS400s, and then there was Linux, maybe, if you wanted it. MIPS died off in the high end because SGI and HP moved their systems onto Itanium. On the low end and embedded scheme of things, ARM CPUs were replacing MIPS and sometimes PowerPC in numerous places at an increasingly rapid rate. Cell phones and handheld game consoles were using increasingly faster and more powerful ARM CPUs, and both the Vita and 3DS were ARM powered. Essentially, there were now two main CPU architectures, ARM and AMD64 or x86-64, and Windows was only on one of them. Also in the early 2010s, Microsoft was playing catch up with the new trendy Apple tablets and phones. Microsoft decided to do several things during this time period. They launched a partnership with Nokia to sell Windows phones exclusively and announced a new brand of tablets called the Surface. During this time, Microsoft worked on a port of Windows NT to ARM as the basis of two operating systems. The first was Windows Phone 8, a mobile OS using Windows NT as the core. The second was Windows RT, a port of the desktop Windows OS to ARM, but heavily locked down to try to force people into the much derided Metro interface. The Surface launched with two products: the Surface RT, which ran Windows RT, and the Surface Pro. The Surface Pro was a smash hit, and perhaps the most influential Windows computer since the netbook craze, and the first success out of the hardware division of Microsoft since the Xbox line. It was an Intel-powered tablet with a detachable keyboard that supported pressure-sensitive pens, and it didn't have an Atom, but it had a full i5. While it was expensive for a tablet, it was essentially a flagship Windows tablet, and unlike a lot of gimmicky devices like high-end Chromebooks, it actually caught on and sold well enough. The Surface RT, on the other hand, was unique and it flopped hard. As it ran Windows RT, customers quickly ran into the limitations of Windows RT. It could run Windows Store programs that ran only in the Metro interface, but it featured a handful of bundled desktop apps that were signed. And it had code signing to only allow Microsoft signed programs to run. And while this signing was quickly defeated with exploits, Microsoft never took the hint and opened up Windows RT already. Instead, they let it die slowly or kept patching the exploits people used to run unsigned code, as the RT became the butt of many jokes. The device ended up sold cheap on the used market or returned to stores as customers found out that it couldn't run The Sims, Google Chrome, or Minecraft. Microsoft did keep ARM Windows around in various forms, however, such as Windows Phone or Windows IoT as a stripped down version for Raspberry Pis and all that. Then around 2017 to 2018, Microsoft decided to make another go at a full-fledged ARM Windows with Windows 10 for ARM, and so far it's only been available in a handful of devices. Computer vendors likely saw how much of a trash fire RT was, and they're taking a wait-and-see policy. The only main Windows 10 ARM devices are from Lenovo and Samsung, along with the ARM-powered Surface Pro X from Microsoft, and the HP NVX2, which was also part of the first wave of Windows ARM devices. Out of these, only the Surface Pro X is easily available in stores worldwide. Best Buy is also selling the Samsung Galaxy Book as well with the phone contract, and I've heard Lenovo has a 5G laptop coming out, so you can fry your brain with 5G waves as you browse the internet. So let's take a look at one such device that I was able to get with Windows for ARM, the Lenovo C630. The Lenovo C630 with Windows ARM is probably one of the best Windows ARM devices around, and it's what I could call a reference device for it, or a great tool for anyone who wants to port their software to a platform that sold badly so far. Aesthetic-wise, it's very similar to a modern Apple laptop or similar ultra-thin laptop. It features two USB-C ports, a headphone jack for listening to sick tunes, and that's about it. It also features a touchscreen that works with the same Windows ink pens the Surface line can use, so even a generic pen will work fine with it. There is sadly no microSD slot, and this is a game breaker because you cannot upgrade the soldered 128 or 256 gigs of storage. It does, however, have 8 gigs of RAM, which makes this thing usable, unlike some of these devices which only have 4 gigs of RAM, which hurts their usability. Hardware-wise, it's a second generation Windows for ARM device. While the first used the Snapdragon 835 straight out of the Note 8 or Mi Mix 2 among others, the second used the 850, a higher clocked 845 for laptops with bigger batteries and heat sinks than phones. There is a third generation, the 8CX, and this only seems to be used in the Galaxy Book S and I think the soon to be released Lenovo Flex 5G. The Surface Pro X features a higher clocked Microsoft branded version of this CPU. And really, the only ARM Windows devices I could find for sale were the Book S and the Surface Pro X. Windows for ARM is designed around a few core selling points that try to differentiate itself from Windows x86 devices, the first one being the battery life. This reminds me of the Windows RT devices, as in the battery lasts around 12 hours for me, at least according to Windows. The standby time for the device is about a week or so, and keep in mind this is a used model, so the battery definitely has been used a bit and it isn't the freshest. Still, the weight is impressive for a laptop like this, and it is lighter than any x86 laptop I've owned, even some of the thinner ones. The interesting part comes when you realize the laptop features no fans or cooling vents whatsoever. Just like a phone, it gets warm, and the battery area gets warm when you charge it. This is great for Apple because they prefer quiet and effective cooling solutions over their customer having to hear a loud fan. The other interesting part is how the laptop comes up right away when you open the lid, because there's no waiting or even a second of black screen. It's up right away. The screen of the laptop is also 1080p, which should be the standard these days. Size-wise, the laptop is thinner and lighter than almost any x86 based laptop I've owned, even the supposedly thin and light ones. It also has Office. LibreOffice runs fine in the emulator though if you don't want to pay, and both Chromium Edge and Firefox are natively supported. You just need to find the Firefox builds on their FTP and folder, since it's not listed on the main Firefox page yet. If you want a normal day-to-day Office laptop to edit Excel files on and send work emails on, this is what this excels at. And all ARM Windows devices feature SIM card slots and modems, so you can just pop in your expensive data plan SIM and start uploading the finest OC memes with blazing fast 4G LTE instead of that slow, overcrowded public Wi-Fi like a peasant. You can also watch your HD anime using a forgotten VLC port, the Windows Store version of VLC, or the stock media player that comes with Windows 10. The screen is full HD and the colors look great, meaning you can watch that HD anime in full HD the way it was intended to be watched. Now let's talk about the big elephant in the room, which is performance and the 32-bit Windows emulator, because you are going to be using this emulator a lot on this thing without even knowing it. So, unlike Windows RT, Windows for ARM features a 32-bit program emulator which lets you emulate 32-bit Windows software. And it does a great job at running basic productivity programs along with many Direct3D games. But it has a lot of obvious shortcomings. And the first major problem with the 32-bit emulator is that most modern software these days is no longer built for 32-bit Windows. See, for the longest time it became a common assumption that 32-bit Windows was on the way out. The last devices to ship with it new were those weird Windows 8.1 tablets and maybe a few netbooks before that. Microsoft even said they are no longer going to be shipping new computers with 32-bit Windows. Some programs still ship in 32-bit only versions or offer both, but more and more programs have been dumping 32-bit in favor of 64-bit only. This means that for free programs you'll need an older version, but for paid programs you might need to search eBay, call up the company that sells the program and try to convince them to sell you an older version, or you might even have to try some less than ethical methods to get old versions of software such as piracy. For productivity software like Word, this isn't much of an issue, but for creative programs, this is a much bigger issue, along with video games. With video games, it's a huge problem because quite a few video games are CPU heavy, and this means that video games that rely on the CPU a lot will struggle. You'll look at the task manager and you'll see one CPU core at 100% and the GPU usage is somewhere around 10 to 20%. Outside of Windows Store games, almost nothing is compiled for the ARM version of Windows, but thankfully compatibility is vastly better than Itanium or non-x86 Windows NT, and your favorite games will at least load even if they run terribly. Older games from the 2000s tend to work just fine, while many older games break from OpenGL to Direct3D shim problems, and in rare cases Direct3D 9 to 12 shim problems. The Adreno GPU drivers do not support OpenGL, and thus a shim inside Windows is used. Windows for ARM only has OpenGL 1.1 support, meaning you can't run Doom 3 or similar games on it. But it's even a bigger issue with creative software and creative programs that make use of OpenGL, because you'd expect to run creative programs on a $1,000 laptop, and yet here's the thing: programs like Clip Studio Paint even, or Adobe or whatnot, they use OpenGL, and when you run them you might get an error message about graphic driver problems or about OpenGL problems. And then the programs will run much worse because there is no OpenGL support from the GPU. So they run horribly. Even worse than if they just had, even worse than the fact that it's just using like emulation for it. It's not only emulating it, but it's emulating it in software mode. And then of course there's games from the 2010s, and some CPU heavy games like Deus Ex have massive frame rate problems because of a high CPU usage. So If you're running games from the 2010s, you'll have frame rate issues. If you're running Deus Ex, it'll have frame rate issues because it's a CPU heavy game. Another core problem with ARM Windows is open source software support, and most software is compiled for either 32-bit or 64-bit x86 and not ARM64 Windows whatsoever. So you might think, oh, I can just compile it, bro. I'll download Visual Studio 2019 Community and compile it. And this is where you run into issues. Microsoft intends that you use Visual Studio 2017 or 19 to build ARM64 software. Some software, such as Dosbox-X, can be ported merely by changing the target, as the developers already set it up and built it for this platform and took care of issues. Most programs with Visual Studio 2017 targets, however, will choke when you attempt to build them, either because it links to x86 code like with MAME, or because it's designed for an old version of the Windows SDK or libraries, like what happened when I tried building SNEX 9X. To add this, Visual C has its own quirks on ARM. The creative developers on Twitter, for example, posted that Visual C does not support neon vectorization extensions on ARM, meaning the resulting build is slow. And quirks like this will harm developers porting their software over. To make matters worse, only Clang is available for Windows ARM because GCC ignores Windows ARM completely. Clang isn't exactly a common compiler outside the Mac, and that's only because Apple bundles Clang with Xcode instead of GCC and really wants you to use Clang. But outside of the Mac, nobody uses Clang. Don't even think about building or compiling software that uses less popular languages such as Free Pascal or Ada. They don't have compiler support for ARM Windows whatsoever. All you'll find are people asking why there's no compiler for it. And in the case of Free Pascal, you'll see the developers saying, just use 32-bit Windows. It'll be slower, but it'll just work. Hey, it's a step above asking why there's no Sims for the Surface RT or PowerPC Windows for the Mac. At least Visual Studio is free now though, so you can try to port stuff over to ARM even if you don't have a device. This means that numerous programs you love will be emulated, and you might need old versions for Windows ARM. Other ports are hidden away on the websites for them, like with Firefox or VLC. Adding to the confusion is the vague error message I mentioned earlier, where it just tells you the SAP can't run, and the fact that about this PC tells you it's running a 64-bit ARM version of Windows. Your average Joe is going to read the 64-bit part and think, whoa, I can run 64-bit programs on this, only to find out it's not going to run his favorite programs. So you know what he'll do? He'll return it or he'll sell it on eBay. And hardware support is even worse. Sure, your printer will likely work if it's not too old or it's any PCL6 or PostScript printer. If you got like a nice LaserJet, doesn't matter how old it is, as long as it's not like a LaserJet 4 with PCL5 only, it'll just work. Especially if it's like a network printer. You can set those up using the PCL6 driver with Windows. You can set up PostScript printers. But, like, good luck using an external Wi-Fi card, for example. Or good luck setting up a printer that uses a Windows host-based driver, because it'll have issues if the printer is more than a few years old. You'll download the drive, you'll connect to it, you'll plug it in, and it just won't work. It'll tell you Windows can't find a driver for this, and that's a message you never get on x86 systems whatsoever, unless you have something really ancient. And that's a difference between ARM Windows as well. ARM Windows lacks hardware support. And despite this though, Windows 10 for ARM isn't too locked down, and you can in fact boot and run the OS to some extent on QEMU or a Raspberry Pi 4 if you want to do some development or porting without shelling $400 for a used ARM laptop or $1,000 for a new one. This quote will be hilarious in hindsight if these flop and they end up costing as much as a Surface RT does, which is $50 right now. That's how much Surface RTs are going for on eBay. And that is a joke, isn't it? Because those were going to change the world, and they flopped. But my biggest concern with Windows for ARM is the fact that these devices are locked down in the upgrade department, even compared to some of the super slim Windows laptops these days. My Lenovo C630 has soldered RAM and soldered storage, but at least the battery is replaceable with a Torx driver if you can take it apart, and the bootloader can be unlocked because it uses a secure boot toggled UEFI setup. No, seriously, did you expect to see the classic AMI BIOS menu on an ARM device instead of the Android recovery menu? Well, now you have. And this also means that when full Linux support eventually comes to this platform, it will just work as well. But what about generic ATX ARM boards with socketed CPUs or even RAM upgrades? What about PCI Express expansion slots? What about ARM boards with tons of cores and CPU power that the average Joe can buy when he goes to Micro Center, right next to the Ryzens and the i7s? What about ARM servers running Windows? When are they going to just make ARM hardware attractive to the average nerd who wants to do more than just have another toy or port his software to something that might or might not be the next big thing? All in all, ARM Windows has potential, hampered by the fact that it's hard to find ARM devices for sale, how locked down many of them are, and software and driver support. It's not Windows RT or non-x86 Windows ports from the past, but it's still not on the level of x86 Windows. If Microsoft wants to improve the situation, they should help port GCC to it and maybe send out free or cheaper devices for developers to port their software to. Quite a few open source developers I know don't know it exists, nor do they own the hardware if they are aware of it existing, and this needs to change. Even if they don't want to give them to those silly open source developers, they could at least send a few to Adobe or other big companies and tell them to port their programs over to it. Honestly, I believe this will be the difference between ARM Windows being the next big thing or another dud like Itanium Windows was. And most of the people owning these aren't developers. They're consumers who are unknowingly beta testers, wondering why something is so slow on their $1,000 laptop. They need to add some 64-bit emulation. They need to add an OpenGL shim, which I know they're working on. And most importantly, they need to actually get these things in the hands of developers. If no developers own these, what makes you think that software support will ever improve, especially if they take the assumption that, well, it can run 32-bit software, just use that, bro. Right now, there are only three demographics for ARM Windows: developers, nerds who want yet another weird tech toy to play with, and businessmen who want something that's exactly like a Chromebook, but with some more software support. The developers are going to port something to it, but they need to be convinced that people will own these. And the nerds will defend any tech product until it fails before admitting that, they might have been wrong. Or not even that. They'll act like they never supported it in the first place. And that is if they didn't buy it for the novelty like I did. And the businessmen will love it until they run something weird and it has an issue with 64-bit software. It's not a normal laptop replacement whatsoever when driver and software support falls short of even a low-end Walmart $300 special. And I'm seeing some cheap Walmart laptops with 1080p screens now. I know someone who ran SolidWorks on an AMD Puma based low-end laptop, and you can't really say the same about an ARM based laptop, because I bet even Crysis would run faster on that cheap laptop, and that's what Microsoft needs to work on. They need to ensure more people own ARM hardware that isn't a flashy toy if they want this to succeed. They need to ensure that all the big software is ported to ARM. They need to ensure that people are making ARM hardware attractive to customers. Sure, there's some guys in the tech industry saying it's the next big thing blindly, but that's exactly what they said about Itanium. You can read any old tech book or magazine from that time, and it'll talk about Itanium. Next big thing, next big thing. It'll eventually replace x86. It did not do that. At least it's fast enough when running native code to prove that ARM maybe isn't exactly the underpowered, slow chip you'd find in a Raspberry Pi or cheap Android tablet from Walmart. But then again, it's also being used in $1,000 laptops instead of $400 ones, so of course it has a nicer CPU than a cheap device would. So all in all, these are my thoughts on ARM Windows and the future from actually owning an ARM Windows device and you trying to use it as a main laptop. It has issues. It's not as bad as like the old non-x86 versions of Windows were, but it's going to need a lot of work if it wants to be relevant, and that is what Microsoft has to work on. Because if they're not, well, nobody will sell these, and Surface Pro X's will be the next Surface RTs on eBay. And that's all I need to say. Thanks for watching and subscribe for more.